types of discrimination with our contemporary horizon of meaning, we would find it difficult to simply replicate that text and the meaning that the text evokes today. It would be considered unjust. So critical hermeneutics challenges us, I think, to raise critical questions. Who has constructed the text? What is perhaps a hidden agenda in the construction of the text? Which parties will gain by the construction of the text? Is there a class struggle? Is there a caste struggle? Is there a nationalistic nation, international struggle? Who constructs text? Why do they construct? All these types of questions critical hermeneutics raises. To some extent, hermeneutics has to be complemented by deconstruction, because sometimes deconstruction is useful because it lays bare power inequalities, relations of inequality, which perhaps hermeneutics has not focused on so much. That is why Ricoeur takes the best of the hermeneutical tradition and allows for Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, who is from the critical theory school, to raise these type of questions. When I make a claim or when I make an interpretation, it has to be meaningful. It has to be true, objectively true. That means I get the best resources that I have to come out with a claim which can be challenged in an open court. It has to be truthful. I am not going to deceive people. I don't have any conscious hidden agenda. And finally, it has to be ethically appropriate. That means not only what I am saying has to be without biases, without certain conscious biases, but it has to be, my communication should be done in a manner that is respectful towards the other person. It's a very comprehensive criteria Habermas puts forward.
I think that certainly explains very well, how hermeneutics, particularly critical hermeneutics, can be put into very good use in understanding historical text and so on. But I would like to ask Dr. Ivo, how deconstruction as well as the postmodernist trends that we find today are related to hermeneutics. There is certainly a link, as Dr. D'Souza rightly said. Maybe Dr. Ivo can put a little more light on this.
Perhaps I'm not the best person to ask about deconstruction, but what I understand is that deconstruction would be one more element in the strategy of suspicion. It would make us sharply aware, for example, that there are polarities in any text, in any situation, power polarities, power inequalities, and so in that sense it would help us to move in the direction of truth. But of course deconstructionists would not like to use these kind of categories, I think. So that is the extent of my familiarity with deconstructionism.
Yeah, please.
May I add to that? You raised a question about the differentiation between myth and history. There are different narrative forms, and of these different narrative forms there is myth, there is history, and there is basic fiction. And one has to delineate the differentiation between these. There is a blurring sometimes, but if one is a scholar, for example, one is expected to know what has more mythological foundation, which is more useful in faith, in belief, in spirituality, in religion. But history has to be open to a wider audience in order to judge its veracity. Fiction, one has more creative license, and sometimes there is a blurring of the distinction, and this causes problems. With regard to deconstruction, deconstruction points out that sometimes the grand narrative, the larger narratives, or the larger community story about itself may attempt to subsume smaller narratives, smaller communities. And there's a process of not only wanting to dominate in terms of telling a story that you want others to accept with all its values, but even the ones who are dominated sometimes want to come up, want to be socially mobile, upwardly mobile, and want to assume those narrative identities.
There are very rightly said. At the same time, you also find there are conflicts between truth claims, be it in the realm of religion, the realm of ethics, the realm of social life, and so on. And you often find these truth claims generate conflicts in the social life too. How we can perhaps usefully apply the theory of hermeneutics or theory of interpretation to understand the truth claims, and how we can find certain consensus. Dr. D'Souza?
I think here the criteria that Habermas puts forward are useful. Appel and Habermas. Those 4 criteria. Any communication should idealistically conform to 4 criteria. Whatever I am putting across should be meaningful. First of all, we should establish the meaningfulness of the claim that I'm putting forward or the story that I'm writing. Clarify if you don't understand with one whom you're having a conversation with. The second one is truth, and here it means that when I make a claim, a serious claim, I am saying that what I am saying is true objectively. Maybe 100 years down the line it may prove to be false, but according to our current perspective, this is what appears to me the truth. And if you have got better argumentation, if you have got better evidence, then I should be happy to look forward to that argumentation and evidence rather than be defensive and want to hold on to my claim. Here is where truth is a beautiful platform upon which the whole human family can meet. That's a beautiful criterion there. Truthfulness, that is a psychological, subjective, ethical, personal condition, is also important. That when I'm communicating, I'm not attempting to mislead you. I'm not playing games here. I'm being serious. And the fourth criterion of being ethically appropriate is also important, which not only means in how I communicate, but also the structures, the social structures that have given rise to communication and that give rise to interpretation. Those structures should, as far as possible, be more just, be more transparent, in which different people who have different power relations are able to express themselves and say what interpretation affects them negatively.
I think the question of meaning is very important. In the sense, meaning is always conditioned by one's own social cultural environment, one's own historical and religious traditions, and so on. How can we understand a little more deeper this whole question of meaning from the Lonergan's point of view? Dr. Ivo, you can tell us a little more about that?
Well, as far as meaning is concerned, I think without claiming a mutual influence, what we have said about Gadamer and Heidegger would be very much acceptable to a person like Lonergan, because he would talk about meaning as constitutive of our being human. So being human is not just a question of having this much body mass and this kind of color, this kind of height. Meaning is very much part of what I am. My history is me in a very special way, in a very real way. And Gadamer has that beautiful aphorism that historically effective consciousness is more being than consciousness. That would be very much what Lonergan talks about in terms of meaning as constitutive of my reality.
Okay, so therefore its meaning is part of my being, that is constituted of my own being. Now, this being is actually lived out in a concrete socio-historical context, and that's where we have problems, and how are we able to find consensus in certain social context? Dr. D'Souza would be able to tell us a little more, because applying this theory of interpretation, we need to find a way forward, particularly in a heterogeneous society or a multi-religious and multi-cultural society. How can we find a certain amount of consensus, which I think we are all struggling with?
If I know the answer to that question, I would be given the Nobel Peace Prize. But I can at least indicate a direction in which we can move towards, arriving at an understanding, mutual understanding. If one does not play games, if one is open and honest and transparent and says, this is the tradition I'm coming from, and these are the weaknesses of my tradition, but these are the strengths of my tradition, and I am ready to listen to you, provided you also are honest and say, this is the tradition I'm coming from, and happy and proud to belong to this tradition, to this religion, to this faith. What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of that? How can we overcome these? How can we create a new human family in which we are not searching for one sort of homogeneous way of being human, because that would be so dull. Each one can contribute to the human family by retaining certain cultural identities, whether it is religion, whether it is dress, whether it is food and other things, provided we are able to also be critical enough to look at our own traditions and say, let us overcome these dysfunctional elements in our tradition. If we live in an ideal world, we can also be openly critical about other people's traditions, but we don't live in an ideal world, so sometimes we are hoping that the intellectuals, those who are more enlightened in different traditions, are able to be self-critical, are able to be critical of their traditions, because it is very difficult to criticize another person's tradition, another person's nation, another person's religion. But ideally, and this is where I think philosophy and hermeneutics is important, is that we must develop self-criticism so that we can criticize ourselves, so that we can grow as better persons, criticize our communities. There is a hermeneutics of belonging, of trust, what is Ricker calls hermeneutics of trust. There is also hermeneutics of suspicion. There must be moments of suspicion where we call into question unhealthy practices, habits, attitudes, patterns, structures, etc., and return again. That's a hermeneutical circle. We start by trusting our tradition, and then with education we come to know there are certain things that are not so good. That is the hermeneutics of suspicion. But we come back. Most of us don't abandon our tradition so easily, unless there is some intellectual revolution that goes on in our minds. That also happens. That is very rare, but it is not always necessary.
I think that's very well said. Self-criticism is important. Criticism of one's own tradition, one's own culture, and so on. Only that will take us to more refined path. To Dr. I would like to ask one more question. That is, apply this theory of hermeneutics or theory of interpretation to our education system today in India. I think it's an area which needs to be a little more addressed, because the kind of pedagogy that we follow in this country and the kind of consequences that gives rise to perhaps not entirely satisfactory. Can we think of a way in which we can better apply the hermeneutical principles to education system in India?
Perhaps before I come to that, I would just like to continue with the question that Dr. D'Souza was trying to answer, a little short of the Nobel Prize if you want. I think when we get together and try to reach mutual understanding, we take for granted that there is a desire for mutual understanding. And in that sense, we must recall Aristotle's great reminder that friendship is a condition for philosophy. I would say friendship is very much a condition for understanding. If we have no desire to understand, then we have stopped before we can begin. If there is a desire to understand, there is still the whole work of coming to self-knowledge, gaining self-criticism, becoming transparent to ourselves in the sense of making our own traditions, where we are coming from, our own cultural backgrounds as transparent as possible. So that friendship as a condition for understanding, I would say, is a very, very important condition. How can we do that? Of course, is another large area. But here is where I think philosophy interfaces with spirituality, with personal growth, with psychology, and so on and so forth. And perhaps some of these things will also spill over into the question that you have asked me about education. And I think all the things that we've been saying about the need for a certain measure of suspicion, the need for self-criticism, the need for self-knowledge, these are things that we would have to bring into our education process, and perhaps insist that education is not just a question of learning by rote and spitting out answers onto an examination paper or in a viva or whatever it is. So the importance of helping our youth, helping students to discover that they have inbuilt principles of criticism, and that they can learn very much from a discipline like hermeneutics.
I think that's very well said. Today's education system requires more critical approach. Very often when we hear the term criticism, it has a negative connotation. But I think when it is applied in academics, particularly in philosophy, it has a very positive connotation, meaning to say there's a critical inquiry into a particular subject, particular tradition or whatever, which is very positive